Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. On today's episode I'm going to show you my technique for gluing new corals into your aquarium. Alright, thank you for joining me on another episode of Parker's Reefs, and today's episode is covering a topic that I have been requested a number of times, so I'm super excited to be able to get the camera out and show you guys how I stick new corals into my aquarium, because I must admit it's one of those techniques that I've just developed or picked up from other reefers over the years, and I take a little bit of second nature now, but I have recently gone over it with a number of newbies on how to get those corals to stick in the position that you want them in your tank, not just for that day, but for weeks and months until they get fully encrusted, and then the glue you put on them doesn't actually really matter so much. And like I said, there is a little bit of finesse to it, so I figured while I've got this frag rack full of new corals here, I'd grab out my tools and we'd go through it and stick some new pieces in together. Let's jump into it. Alright, here we are, some of the frags that I mentioned. Some of these have been cut from the tank, like a couple of Walt Disney frags here and a couple of my blue stags and other bits and pieces here, but there are some new pieces on this rack here that are going into the tank. So I've opened up the hood and lifted my light frame right up as high as it'll go. I'll take the mesh custom jump lid off the tank, and just before we do that, I'll just run you through the tools I've got here to get the job done. I've got a towel, always important, and I've got my coral look down viewer from Hamali, Australia. I've got my trusty pocket knife, which you can see there from the epoxy marks on the blade, is basically what I use to cut up the epoxy. I've got two different types of two-part epoxy here. To be honest, I mostly use the aqua kneaded here, which is exactly the same as this purple one here, which is an aquarium branded one. That one just ends up purple, this one ends up white. Same in my opinion, grab whichever one's easier to you. You'll find your local fish shops will carry this one, your hardware stores will carry this one. I've then got my BSI IC gel. To be honest, I've used a lot of different super glues and I find them to be fairly similar, particularly when you go for this method here by combining the epoxy with the super glue. The type of super glue you use becomes a little less important. And then last but not least, I've got my Fragmate coral cutters there, just in case I want to snip the stem off the frag tiles. Like I said, I do have a towel there, an old towel, just so I can wipe my hands on it, because I will have my hands in and out of the tank a little bit. Next thing we've got to do is find a spot to put our frags. Now, if I take you over here, I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see, but we'll do our best. Down there is a nice blank bit of rock with a hole that I'm hoping I can stick one of those new frags on. I'm thinking the green Anicapora is going to go on there quite nicely. The green goblin I want to have sticking out this way towards the camera here, coming out of that hole. So that's the one we'll demonstrate. We'll get up on a stool now and get these corals out, and I'll run you through the process of the sandwich method. Alright, now that we're in position here, I've got my tools up here ready to go. I've got my top-down viewer. You notice I don't turn the flow off or even point the outlets down. That's what the top-down viewer is for. That'll help me guide in position where I want to put this coral, but we'll worry about that a little bit later. First of all, we've got to prepare the coral itself, so I'm just going to get him off the frag rack. Looks like he's got a little choker snail hitchhiker, which we'll just gently remove and pop him on the glass so that he can keep doing the good work there, fighting the good fight for us. If he wants to stick to the glass, oh well, your choice, buddy. Fair it out on the sand. Alright, so here's our frag here. Now, you can see this one does have a stem on it. It has a fairly large sized stem. I'm just going to test to see whether it's actually going to fit into the hole, because if it does, that will give me something to basically base the foundation off. I'll glue around this here so that when it goes into the hole in the rock, it gives it something to hold onto. If it doesn't, I'll end up cutting this stem off using my frag cutters here. So I've just got the disc to work with, and then I will glue an epoxy onto the bottom of the disc. But I'll just give that a trial first. If anyone is squeamish, look away now, because it's time to lose the shirt. Alright, let's see if that'll reach down into the spot. Looks like it probably will pretty well. Alright, well that is good news. Now that I know that is going to fit in the hole, it means I will leave the stem on this plug and we'll work our super glue and epoxy around there. So we've got to get that ready. First of all, for the sandwich method, I go super glue first, then we go some epoxy, then we go super glue again. Now, that means I would put super glue on the tile first, but before I do that, I'm just going to prepare the epoxy first. So I'm just going to leave that frag aside for a second. Let's get some of our epoxy here out, because this does take a little bit longer. So rather than putting the super glue on first, then mixing this up, by then the super glue is probably already set. So I'm just going to take the little protective sticker, I guess you'd call it, off the end there. Cut a little bit of this off using the knife here. You can be pretty liberal with this stuff. The only downside is this one in particular is going to mix up white, so if you have a huge golf ball of it, it's going to be fairly, it's going to stand out a little bit, I guess. I'm just going to pop the cover back on that, put the protective screw back on that, and pop our epoxy away, because I'm not going to need that now. Now that I've cut this off, you'll see I've got a green outer bit and a white inner. I've already taken the plastic wrap off it. What I'm going to do now is just get my fingers wet, because I find if my fingers are wet, it doesn't stick to my fingers as much. Now I can basically mix this up. So the idea is we want to mix these two colors together until it's one uniform color, or it should remain completely white. But we want to make sure there's no sort of chunks of green in there. Once the two are mixed together, that's when they're activated. And you'll notice I just keep dipping my fingers in the water, because the wetter my fingers are, the less it's going to stick to them, and then I won't have a second fingerprint for the rest of the day. Of course, you could use gloves, but I find the gloves just take away a little bit of my feel, which does get a little bit annoying when you're trying to put this epoxy into a pretty specific spot and you can't feel through the gloves. But if you've got some good fine gloves to keep your fingers clean, happy days. All right, that epoxy's been kneaded together pretty well now, and you can see I don't have too much on my fingers. They're still pretty clean because I was dipping them in the water, and our epoxy now can just sort of sit aside for a second while it starts to set. I can then grab our tile. What I'm going to do first is put a layer of super glue around the stem here. Then I will put the epoxy over the super glue, so I might even get that into shape first, because we might wrap it around this. So we've got a nice long bit of epoxy there. Then we'll put super glue over that again. The super glue on the outside will hold it to the rock first, hopefully long enough for the epoxy in the middle to really set it to the rock. Then that'll hold there for weeks or months until this encrusts all the way around and holds itself in place. So let's give that a shot. We'll get the super glue out. You can see I'm not shy with super glue. It's ultimately not very expensive stuff. Now, I'm going to grab my epoxy, I'm going to wrap that around. I've probably got a little too much epoxy, which is fine. Take that off, sit him aside for the next frag. And you'll see in there we've got this nice little super glue base with epoxy over that. Happy days. I could actually use some super glue Insta Set to get that super glue to set straight away now, but just going to dip it in the water to help sort of activate it. Sit him aside for a second. I can move our glue almost out of the way. I can definitely get this spare bit of epoxy out of the way. I don't want to knock that into the tank and give our skimmer something to work hard over. Once our super glue starts to set a little bit, you can already see, well, I think you can see on camera there that it's starting to go a bit opaque, which is a good sign. Obviously our epoxy still has plenty of setting time left in it, but it's going to give us something to really squish into that hole.
A few moments later.
All right, now that I'm pretty happy that super glue started to set pretty good, I'm just going to add another little layer of it around the outside. A little bit on the base. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to set that coral aside for a second while I just let the super glue begin to set. I'm going to move this camera down into position so you can see the coral getting stuck on the rock. All right, moment of truth with the guide of my top down, because this is a heck of a reach where this coral's going. I'm just going to reach on down. Try and really squish that epoxy in there. And just like that, what we should find now is that super glue will hold it for the initial period, long enough for the epoxy to set. Then once the epoxy is set, that's going to hold it for quite some time until the coral can encrust over, and then it'll stay there forever. All right, next up we're going to do the same, just this time I'm going to glue this pink digi I have here, which again has another hitchhiking snail that I'm just going to have to yank off there and stick him on the glue. Now this pink digi doesn't have any stem on the tile at all, so That's okay, I can still use the tile. I just find it a little bit easier to glue to the tile than I do to the frag. I know some of you guys out there don't want the tiles in your tank, and I completely understand that. In reality, I find if your coral's growing fast enough, you're not going to see that tile fairly quickly anyway, so I personally don't worry about it, but each is up to their own. Now this one, I'm pretty sure I've got a dead colony here that just got strangled by a couple of other colonies, and I reckon I'm going to stick this one on top of that, and that looks like a great spot to me. So I'm going to get this guy ready to go on there. We're going to do exactly the same process again. So we're going to use the sandwich method. Again, we're going to go super glue, epoxy, super glue. Let's make it happen. First and foremost, I got my tile here. Let's give it a little wipe to make sure it's relatively clean. If you've got any I guess surface algae or anything on there, that's just going to slime off pretty quickly. You could give that a little dab on the towel, which seeing I have a towel here, I will. Alright, so now I can just give that a little bit of super glue. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. Try to get a little bit of the contact surface area on there. Now I'm not going to put the cap on the super glue just yet, because in a minute I will use it again. I've got a little bit of leftover epoxy from the previous frag. I could probably mix up more, to be honest, but this will be enough. We'll make that work. Just going to sit that over the top, basically make a little dome. I'm not sure how well you can see that. A little dome to go over the super glue. Try and encapsulate that super glue in there. It starts to spill out the side. Hopefully not get too much on your fingers. It's going to dip that in the water, which will help keep the coral moist, but it should also help get that super glue setting a little bit. Try and keep my cleaner wrasse away from it who thinks the super glue looks like it'd be nice to eat. Alright, that's looking pretty good there. You can just see some of the super glue spilling out around the side, and we've got a nice big soft epoxy to work with there. I'll give that a little bit longer, then I'll put the second layer of super glue on.
A few moments later.
Alright, here we go. Let's put the second layer of super glue on. Again, I'm going to be pretty liberal with this stuff because ultimately, compared to the price of these corals, super glue is dirt cheap. So it's not the time to skimp. The worst case here is you put too much glue on and you get it on your fingers, and I don't know about you, but I don't care too much about my fingers. I want this coral to stick, because if I find it upside down, it ain't going to go too well. Now, before that glue sets, I'm just going to move the camera down so you can see where I'm going to stick this onto that dead colony. We'll go from there. Alright, hopefully that angle is okay. Just going to get my top-down viewer, take the coral in, and there's a nice bit of solid colony from the previous coral here that I'm going to stick it to. I'm going to get that super glue and epoxy straight in there, so it's got a good bit of something to grab onto, and that boy there is a rock solid. As soon as that super glue sets, that'll hold it till the epoxy sets. Once the epoxy's set, that bad boy is not moving anywhere. Simple as that, guys.
Alright guys, there you have it. That is my sandwich method for gluing new corals into my dream reef tank. Now, I know some of you are at home are going to be saying, sure, that's fine for little frags on tiles. What about bigger pieces like big hammers or big SPS colonies and things where you want to mount them maybe hanging off an edge a little bit more and sort of defy gravity a bit more? For that situation, I would use exactly the same process with a couple of extra little additions. First and foremost, you want to have something that you can sit in the tank that's going to help take the weight off that coral so that the glue can set it in place while it is curing, whether it be a bit of PVC or a bit of egg crate or something that you can use to just hold the coral in place, even if it looks ugly for a good half an hour to a couple of hours, just to let that glue really set in place. It'll just help take the load off it. The second thing I would also recommend, if you've got something that's going to be a little bit more intensive on the glue, you can actually mix a little bit of super glue into your epoxy. Now, if you're going to do that, I would highly recommend you do put gloves on. Just squirt a little bit of a super glue in when you're mixing up that two-part epoxy. That's going to give you a pretty vicious little gluing combination there that I find works really good when you need to get pretty creative with your mounting of corals. But for the rest of the time, probably 95% of the use cases, I go the simple super glue, epoxy, super glue sandwich method, and it works a treat for me. It does also give the ability, like you saw in the footage, if I needed to remove a colony, if I needed to treat an aptasia or something, or get it, flatworm something off it, or in this instance, just remove it so I could cut a couple of frags off it. It is actually possible to pull it off the rock, and the epoxy will stay in the shape of the rock for you to easily glue a bit of super glue back on it and put it back in place. Because the epoxy has set around the shape of that rock, it actually gives it a very nice hold and will glue back in easy enough. Speaking of which, I probably need to get back in and glue some of these colonies back in, as well as maybe taking a couple more frags while I'm there before I clean the glass back up and have this tank looking ship shape. If you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, please feel free to pop them in the comments section down below. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and maybe even subscribing by that button down in the bottom corner. Other than that, guys, till next time, stay safe, keep reefing. Cheers, bye.